Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois. I'm Joe Crane, the Director of Public Programs and Community Engagement. We invite you to another Facebook Live event. This time around, it's part of our Illinois History Forum series. Today, we're going to take a look at Civil War letters as Illinois soldiers write home in their own letters, in their own words. We'll learn more about the book, how it came about, and of course, meet the author here in just a moment. But before we get underway, remind you that if you have a question throughout the discussion, please post in the comments section below. And even if you don't have a question, be sure to let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the state, across the country, even around the world, because we like to keep tabs of where everybody's checking in from. So we hope to hear from you soon right here on Facebook. And to get the program started, we welcome our Oral History Program Director, Dr. Mark DePue. Good afternoon, Mark.
Good afternoon, and thank you for that introduction, Joe. Today I have the pleasure to talk to a good friend of mine. You and I have known each other for quite a few years here, Mark, and been colleagues. I like to think that we've collaborated successfully on several different things. You're an anthropologist by training. You got your degree in anthropology, and then you ended up in state government. I know you had 30 years with the Illinois Department of Health, and you finished off that time as the chief, the Illinois Center of Health Statistics. Boy, if there's ever some places the focus of what's going on right now in the world, that would be it. Something of a demographer and a statistician. See, I can even say that term. But also, I know you got into poetry a little bit later in life, and I think that has something to do with this book. So where I want to start is just ask you how it is that you came to write this book.
Yeah, well, thank you for that introduction, Mark. The idea for the book was actually a poetry project. I was inspired also by you with your series of lectures at the time of the sesquicentennial of the Civil War. And I wanted to write some commemorative poetry that if soldiers of the day were reading it, that they would feel comfortable and it would be something that they could relate to. So I started doing some research on that, and I thought I could find a book or two that would have that sort of information in there, especially for Illinois, but I would have taken the Midwest. But I couldn't really find such a book, so I thought, I'm going to have to do this the hard way. So I came over here to the Presidential Library, actually just a couple doors down here on the second floor of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, to look at manuscripts and personal letters. And I went through the card catalog and picked out as many Illinois soldiers as I could find and just started. And then after a couple years, 3 years, I had enough for the poetry project, wrote various poems. I gave a presentation on those at the Vachel Lindsay home, Poets in the Parlor series. And then they actually ended up downstairs in the atrium for several months, hung up as 2 poster boards. I think that was 2015, so that would have been the last year of the sesquicentennial. But at that point, I had read so many letters, and I could not find that book at the beginning that I'd been looking for. I thought, maybe there's a need there. Maybe I should start working on that. And so I read more and then finally put in a book proposal and finally got the book.
And spent how long diving into these letters?
I don't know. I've read at least a few thousand. I don't know how many hours. I started in 2013 reading, and for the book, I was probably reading up to 2018, 2019. I am still coming across other collections that I'm interested in and still reading.
One of the things that really struck me about how you developed this book is the organization of it. Can you talk a little bit about how you decided to organize these letters?
Well, the truth of the matter is the content was determined by the soldiers and not so much by me. So when I started the reading process, I remember, I think it was Debbie Ham, who was in manuscripts, and she brought me the first collection, and she said to me, so what are you looking for in the collections? And I this is going to sound like a flippant answer, but it was the truth. I said, well, I don't really know what I'm looking for, nor do I know that I'll recognize it when I see it. But I just started writing down things, and as I kept going through letters after letters, things started to coalesce. There were certain topics that they wrote about, and some of those turned into sections, and then those sections turned into chapters. And so the chapters are thematic. But it was the soldiers that basically told me what the content was going to be. And so I just chose what I thought were good examples of various things, whether that be them doing duty, sickness and trying to maintain health, whether that was combat, whether that was trying to manage affairs from afar, home life, that kind of thing. They all coalesce that way.
Well, when we started talking about how we wanted to do this, you were gracious enough to say, well, why don't you pick some things that really moved you?
Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, yeah.
So a lot of the things that I'm going to be asking you about is the things that I found compelling when I went through here. And the first one, if we can go to the next slide here, this is Private Thomas Seacord. Do you want to just say one or two words about him? And here's the cover of the book, by the way.
Oh, yeah. Thomas Seacord, he was active in some of the Mississippi campaigns and so on. He started his writing his letters actually from, I don't remember if he was one of the people at Camp Butler, but he definitely wrote letters home to his spouse from Camp Defiance, which is where Cairo is.
And I know one of the invaluable parts of your book is that as an appendix, you've got a little short narrative about all these people that you're highlighting in their letters.
Yes, there's 165 different people that I took from, and so I have a short biography for each one of those.
Well, why did I find Thomas Seacord so compelling? This is the text, but if we can get the zoom in on that text, and you can read it. Sometimes it's a little bit difficult, but here's part of the text that I really found moving. I will write as often as you will. Your letters are worth more to me than gold. And I thought that kind of summed up the whole project.
Yeah, it very much does. Let me give you sort of a very similar but counter quotation, which is actually on the next page of the book. And this is someone writing in May 1865. And he writes, I often noticed my companions how tired and fatigued they would look after a long day march. Some of them would almost seem as though life itself was a burden to them. But oh, what a change has come over their countenance, a change from sorrow to joy. What has caused it? Has there been a great victory? Or has peace been declared? No. The mail has come into camp, and they have received letters from their loved ones at home. Yes, that accounts for it. For the time being, all their hardships and suffering are forgotten, all through the medicine of a letter.
You know, you're reading that quote, it reminds me, as the oral historian, I've interviewed hundreds of veterans, obviously not from the Civil War, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, War on Terror, and that's a constant theme. That communication from home, whether it's letters or phone calls or emails and texts today, it is so important to these soldiers.
Back then, letters for them were the next best thing to being there. I mean, today maybe it's Zoom or Facebook Live, but back then it was definitely letters.
Well, on this next slide, I want to go to one of the biggest challenges you had to face, because the educational level of the soldiers at that time and their writing skills wasn't quite up to what we would expect today. And so the question is, how did you sort through all of this and figure out what they were actually trying to say?
So when I went to start looking at these letter collections, in the back of my mind, I was hoping that there would be transcriptions, so I could just follow the transcriptions. But no, those were very rare. And in retrospect, I learned not to trust any previous transcriptions by others. I got very adept at reading them and finding mistakes and so on, so I realized, you know what, if you want it done right, you got to do it yourself. Well, also on day one, if you can't read cursive writing, game over. You have to be able to read cursive writing. And there's different.
We should be teaching cursive writing at school today?
I'm not saying that. I'm just saying maybe if you're going to go into history and you're going to be reading old documents or letters, even if it's just from World War II or the Korean War, you're going to need to be able to read cursive writing. But I also found that there was not much in the way of punctuation. So on this slide, you've circled the only 3 places where there's even any kind of punctuation on the letter. And there are some people that wrote during the time that used, punctuation pretty much the way we did. But that was almost the exception rather than the rule. And I've come to learn that part of the reason for this is because they are writing many times as if they are speaking to someone. So if you are speaking to someone, you do not say, I am fine, period. How are you, question mark. No, you leave that punctuation off. Plus, they are also writing to loved ones, other family members, relatives, close friends, who know what their voice sounds like, what their inflections are, what their accent is like, and so on. So punctuation is almost superfluous in that regard. So you have to mentally get into their head as you read various soldiers' letters on how, you almost get a sense for how they spoke sometimes.
Do you have a sense of the educational level that most of these soldiers had?
I don't know about educational level, but so in the 1870 National Decennial Census was the first time they asked about literacy. And so for Illinois, it was just about 90%. So if you want to backtrack to 5 or 10 years earlier, it's got to be at least 80 or 85% were literate. But as you find out as you read the letters, you find that there is a gamut of literacy. That is, some people write phonetically. And soldiers is spelled Solgers instead of their correct spelling. So you kind of get into that, and you're able to sort of figure out their words. And in the book, I have not made it into good English. So if they have misspellings and lack of punctuation, that is in there. Now, when I feel like it gets too difficult, in brackets, I'll put in a little bit of help on what I think that word is that you might not quite recognize. But that is part of the reading experience, although in the book, I save you having to read cursive writing.
Well, the thing that strikes me about this time period, we can be critical about how poorly they spelled or the lack of punctuation and things like that. The United States, in my understanding, is far exceeded any other country in the world at this time for literacy.
That could be true. That could be true. And I think most of them did, and I think those that could not write, they had fellow soldiers in their tent or their company who could write for them. They still wanted to communicate with home. And as a matter of fact, soldiers that were wounded and for some reason couldn't, they could get people from the Sanitary Commission or other people that would write letters for them home.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's one chapter called A Lifeline of Letters. It's the first chapter, and that's what these letters were for them. Not only did they want to write letters, but they were desperate, as we just read before, to receive them as well.
Yeah. Well, let's go to this next slide, and it's really the first lengthy quote. I'm calling this Seeing the Elephant, which you know, and most people who are Civil War historians and know about the Civil War, that means you've seen combat. Tell us a little bit about Captain David Norton.
Yes. Captain Norton is writing to Mary Chapman. This is an interesting story because they had not met. And Captain Norton, from a fellow officer, got a dare. I dare you to write to this lady named Mary Chapman, whom he called Molly, back home. And so Captain Norton sort of used that slim introduction to write an initial letter to her to try and get a correspondence going. And as you go through the correspondence, which is another collection here in the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, you can tell they're sort of building up this intimacy. They exchange pictures. They talk about a little bit what life at home might be if they got together, and so on and so on. So he is making a mighty effort to impress her through his letters.
And when we were talking about this, Mark, the thing that impressed me was we've got this excerpt from this letter that, as you said, goes on and on and on.
Yeah, this is a lengthy letter, so you can tell he's really trying to make a good impression. But he was an officer who was an aide to a general. And so he had ins and perspectives that a lot of other soldiers on the ground might not have of this particular engagement here at Missionary Ridge, which was part of the Chattanooga campaign.
Yeah, and one of the reasons that I found so compelling about this particular excerpt, because it was about Missionary Ridge, which is my absolute favorite moment of the Civil War.
Okay.
And I think as you listen to this clip, you'll understand why. So if you could play that, please.
Orders were given for our lines to move up nearer to the rebels and for our skirmishers to drive the rebels into their long lines of entrenchments at the foot of Missionary Ridge. It was gallantly done, and General Baird's division of 14th Corps, ours, was ordered to assault the enemy's works to create a diversion in favor of Hooker, who could be heard opening his part of the game. Gallantly, those noblemen charged across the open field which separated them from the enemy amidst a perfect storm of shots and shells. They have taken the entrenchments. Here they were ordered to stop. But no, the balls were flying too thick. They could not stop and live. And absolutely without orders, they charged on up the hill. A thrill of anguish passed through every frame. "They are lost," cries General Grant. "Send the whole corps after them." But long before the order could be carried to the anxious troops, a shout that shook the earth went up from those devoted comrades, and forward they rushed upon what seemed to be inevitable destruction. Onward and upward sped those intrepid soldiers. Backward fly the astonished and frightened rebels. Oh, how beautiful those starry flags looked as they fluttered up that steep mountainside covered with bristling bayonets and cannon. Do they pause to await the arrival of their slower comrades? No. Every man pushes forward into the very mouths of the fierce cannon, and with a cheer, slay, or capture or drive away the rebel artillerists. The enemy, completely dumbfoundered, fly, and our victorious boys start down the hill after them. The victory, the most glorious of the war, is ours.
And I would kind of agree with him, maybe the most glorious. It was extremely rare that you had an assault like this against an entrenched enemy on the top of a hill, and that was successful.
Now, I need to add a counterpoint here. This kind of description of combat or a major battle is extremely rare, and that is one of the reasons why I happen to include this. More often when a soldier was in a battle and they wrote home about it, unless it was the first battle, when it was kind of a novelty to them, and they might describe different things that happened, so their parents or their spouse knows a little bit of what's going on. Their description of a battle will be, for example, if we'll take Missionary Ridge, we fought a great battle at Missionary Ridge. I'm okay or not okay. So-and-so that you know is doing fine or was wounded. But you can read all about the particulars in the newspapers because they'll probably know more about it than I do. And that's it. So that was, again, part of that lifeline kind of thing. Hey, I know you read about the battle and you know that our regiment was there. I'm okay, I'm okay. That was what they wanted to convey, not this, some sort of description of what the combat was like.
You mentioned that this captain was on a general staff. Well, the average soldier's experience and his perspective is maybe the 10 or 20 guys he can see around him.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, this next one, I don't know if you want to mention anything about Second Lieutenant Z. Payson Shumway before I actually read this one to the audience.
No, just go ahead.
And I will tell you this, that this is written from a camp near Jackson, Mississippi.
Yes.
In July 19th, 1863. And the significant part of that is this would have been right after the surrender of Vicksburg.
That's correct.
In Mississippi.
That's correct.
So there they are sitting around the campsite. Just after dark, one of our boys sat down to a piano and sang and played Home Sweet Home. Of course, that old tune soon brought those of the boys who were not on post together. Before the song was half through, I could see by the light of the burning town and cotton that the silent tears stood in many an eye, which of late had been all unused to weep.
Yeah, so a very poignant moment. And it reminds me of Christian McWhirter's book, Battle Hymns, and the power of Civil War music. Here is somebody playing on a piano for some bizarre reason is in the entrenchments or on the rampart somewhere, and they're playing it. Well, it turns out that prior to the Union capturing that there was somebody named Private Douglas Carter of Texas who played on that same piano before it was captured during the siege. And that same piano still exists. He was able to get that. That is this Private Douglas Carter of Texas. And the piano resides in the Confederate Memorial Hall Museum in New Orleans.
Ah.
So you can still see it. So there's, and when I found this on somebody's website, they didn't know the Union side of it. They knew about the Confederate part. So I was able to make this connection on what Shumway wrote about.
And your comments here just illustrated another thing I think was so successful in how you put this book together. The narration that you use to tie all these things together and to give the background and the context, I think is invaluable and helping people really enjoy this that much more. So kudos in that respect.
Well, thank you, but that's the job of any editor, really.
Okay, and let's go to the next slide if we can. And I'm going to read a quote from a letter written by Private Victor Gould to the parents of Private George Clark. And this one really struck me. M. George, your son fell mortally wounded. He was struck with a shell tearing his body most desperately, and also tearing both legs almost entirely off. He lived 1 hour and then quietly fell asleep, leaving many true and loving and I trust Christian friends to mourn his loss. Tell my parents, said he, that I die a brave man and in defense of my country. Wow. But the thing that surprises me, Mark, on this, he wrote the parents about the gory, gory details of his death.
My experience in general, whether it is about death or specific details about the wounded or horrible circumstances, I was often surprised what they would write to their mom or their sister or their spouse or significant other that it might almost seem inappropriate. But again, as I had said, they had, as the soldiers, a need to express themselves, to get this sort of out, and to people back home what was going on, but for them as a kind of release of what's going on. But there's another thing going on here. So, and this is covered in a book by Drew Gilpin Faust called This Republic of Suffering. And she talks about, at that time, what they called the good death. That is, being surrounded by family and friends as, you know, you're on your deathbed and, you know, you have your affairs in order, you're wishing people well, and, you know, those kinds of things. Well, a civil war and battlefields totally mess that up, totally complicated, and so on. But for loved ones or parents to find out the circumstances of their sons or brothers or husband's death was of a comfort to them, even if there were gory details that were being described to them. That was part of knowing how it occurred. And that is as close as they could get to being with them or experiencing that at that moment.
Amazing. Well, the next one that I selected was Sergeant William Smith to his wife. And I think I'll let you talk a little bit more about that to set this one up. But it's talking about what some call the peculiar institution, what we all know today as slavery.
William Smith was not only a fairly good writer, but he was expressive and he seemed naturally inquisitive. So he talked to Southerners when they were in, occupied territory, the citizens and so on. But he, as I said, he was a keen observer. And his wife, Mary, who he called Polly, asked him this question about slavery. And you have to remember that the median age of Union soldiers, and probably Illinois soldiers as well, was around between 23 and 24 years of age. Median meaning that at that age, half of them are younger than that and the other half are older than that. So that means there's a lot of teenagers and people in their early 20s and so on that are soldiers, many of them who had never left their state. I was just reading a letter from someone who lived only 2 counties away from the Mississippi River, but had never seen the Mississippi River until they went to Alton and had never seen a steamboat before. So there's all these new experiences. So his wife is asking him about slavery. So we should hear this clip.
Now to the question, how does slavery look to the naked eye? The shortest answer that I can give and express myself upon the subject is that it looks many times worse than I ever imagined. It is true that I have never saw the lash across the backs of old men and gray-headed women, but I have seen men plow, hoe, chop, and maul rails with not enough clothing on them to hide their bodies. I have saw pregnant women at the hardest work with only an excuse for a shirt and short petticoat on. I've seen dozens of men, women, and children at the different kinds of work under a white man that was almost as ignorant as the slaves he drove. I have seen one woman that has tended 18 acres of corn and suckled an infant that was born after she commenced to break the ground. I have seen a young wife, modest and nice, walking along the street, a slave woman walking close behind her, carrying the firstborn of her modest mistress. Look at their figures. It is very nearly the same. See their backs? Oh, says one, they are both alike. Look at their gait. It is nearly the same. Examine their features. Look close. They certainly resemble. Ask the young mistress where she got her slave. She tells you that she was a wedding gift from her father. The secret is out. They are half-sisters. Look at them again. They favor in every feature and action. The only difference is in the color.
Now we're hearing a letter written by William, read by his wife, and you can imagine she's reading to relatives, she's going to the local store. Other opportunities she would share this letter with people.
The point that is being made here is very poignant and very well expressed. It just really sinks in what slavery can be like, or what they had also called amalgamation. That is the joining of 2 different races, which is a much different opinion than it's old thinking, if you will. But he makes this point so well, what really goes on in a slavery state or under slavery conditions. And what is sort of interesting about this is, so there was this little something at the end of the letter, and I have it in the book here, and it says, in the same letter, along the margin of its last page, written sideways, is a drawing of a single hand pointing to a sort of postscript. And the postscript was, Charlie, which was Smith's tent mate, says, for you to burn this without reading it. because it was, such a topic to put into a letter like that you should just burn the letter, don't even read it. So fortunately, Mary ignored that jest request. But it's great that we have it and can learn from it.
Well, and that's the point of this whole book and all of these letters. We get into their hearts and souls by reading these things.
You have to remember that we are essentially reading other people's mail. And I have to admit, there's kind of an allure to that. But also, it was something never intended for us to read. I think if those people were still alive and they, found out some of their personal letters were showing up in a book, they might be aghast at that. But for us as historians, it's invaluable.
Have you heard from some of the descendants of these people who are in the book?
Yes, some I have, and of course they're not the original soldiers. They're great-great-grandchildren, those kinds of things, and they're thrilled.
Yeah.
I've gotten some really nice comments. People have shared portraits. Other people have seen who's in there, and they say, "Hey, I have something about that person." So I've discovered a number of other things, and a lot of those things I've put up on the website. So the website makes the book a little bit more of a living document.
Well, the next thing I wanted to focus on in this next slide is a little bit about the motivations and the feelings, beliefs that the soldiers themselves had about the cause they're fighting for. And so I've selected a passage that touches both on the Emancipation Proclamation, which was written after Antietam in September of '62,
okay,
and then actually went into force on January 1st of 1863. And then a little bit about the upcoming election of Honest Abe, Old Abe. So we'll play this one from Captain Amos Hostetter.
In answer to part of Owen's letter, in regard to the opinion of the soldiers, in regard to the Emancipation Proclamation, etc., I have this to say, that if the people of the North knew how the soldiers cursed them for allowing men to speak treason as they do now, I think they would put a stop to it. Men that came here strong Democrats are Democrats no longer. Men who came here with no intention of interfering with slavery are now abolitionists. And in regard to their opinion of the administration, if the soldiers can vote in 1864 for President of the U.S., Old Abe will again be president. You may not believe what I have told you, but if you live to see 1864, you will find my words true if Old Abe carries out what he has commenced. Although we are tired of war, we had rather fight for the next 10 years than compromise with treason.
Strong words.
Yeah, now again, I'm going to have to offer a counterpoint. This is not necessarily the majority opinion among the soldiers. And this is, especially something like this, which is somewhat political, really reflects the diversity of Democrats and Republicans in Illinois. In fact, Illinois is in some ways, at this time, almost a microcosm of the entire nation on how it's divided in terms of opinion. So the opinions on the Emancipation Proclamation that you find by other soldiers varies quite a bit. Some of them think this is a terrible idea because now the South is going to fight all the harder. They are going to be so mad at us that they're really going to dig in their heels, kind of thing. But a lot of them do look at it first as a war measure, as opposed to a social measure. But they had comments about that as well. Some thought, well, this could be a good thing. Some thought, well, this is not a good thing. So I put a lot of that diversity in here. So I wanted to sort of offer that sort of counterpoint just based on what you happened to pick out. If you had picked out one that said, oh, this is a bad idea, I would have read one where, hey, this person thinks it's a good idea.
Well, if you want a little bit more of this or a lot more of this, go visit the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum. You got
Absolutely.
That hallway with all these dissonant voices on all the different opinions, strong
Yes.
opinions they had on this very subject.
Yes. Yeah.
That's one of my favorite parts because it really does show the angst and the difficulty that Abraham Lincoln faced when he was President of the United States.
Yeah, at the beginning of the war, certainly not all the soldiers in Illinois that signed up were abolitionists. In fact, they would have been quite a minority. But some of them came to see this when it did happen, that is the Emancipation Proclamation, that it was a good thing because it would shorten the war and they would get home sooner. That was the overriding thought that would be in the back of their minds all the time. And that's why they kept up on politics in newspapers, because they were looking for signs and symptoms of the war starting to come to a conclusion, and when will we be home?
There weren't any that says this is only going to lengthen the war?
Yeah, there were some that said, yes, this could potentially lengthen the war.
I think most historians today would come down on the side of the latter, but that's a debatable point, as oftentimes historical issues are. Now, I've highlighted a lot of the things that I've found really interesting. Tell me what some of your favorite letters are.
Okay, so as a social scientist, I'd have to say that my favorites were the 165 soldiers that made the cut, that made it into the book. Some of them wrote more eloquently, expressed themselves better than others, but every one of them had something to say that contributed to the book. So it's probably not the answer you're looking for, but I really don't have any favorites. Now, it is your prerogative as a reader to have favorites on what you happen to like, and thanks for sharing those. But I'm glad to have all of them, quite frankly.
As you mentioned, I gave a series of presentations on the main Civil War battles during the sesquicentennial.
Yeah.
So that was my deep dive into Civil War history. I learned so much going through that process. This exercise was quite different for you. You had to have enough knowledge about the war to put all these things in context, but it strikes me that you got to know these soldiers on a much more personal level. Is that a good way of saying it?
Yeah, the way that I sort of think of it is, a lot of times when you read Civil War books that are about particular battles, campaigns and so on, generals, those are great. That's a top-down approach. My approach was the opposite, was to start with the boots in the mud, the soldiers, what their stories were, and then coalesce those into those topics, those sections and chapters. So I was very much a bottom-up approach to find out what the Civil War was like for them.
Let's see. You got your degree in anthology?
Anthropology.
Anthropology. I knew I was going to mess it up. Then you're a demographer, you're a statistician. I know you do archaeology as well. And then poetry. And then this.
Yeah.
Where's the link with the poetry and then this, with all those other things?
I've always enjoyed, I've always enjoyed writing, but I'm not what I think of as a naturally gifted writer. I need a lot of practice. So poetry helped me smooth out my style. And writing this book, one of the preludes to the book, not only was the poetry, but as I was collecting the letters, I started to see some of these themes. So I had a selection of colleagues, friends, even people in other countries who could care less about the Civil War. Each Friday, I would send out an email which was themed based, things that I've been reading in letters. And I was surprised at how eager people that didn't even know anything about the Civil War wanted to hear these personal stories. And so that got me practicing writing and got me to get those topics together. Then the book came together after that when I decided finally to do a book that coalesced. So I call these sort of the 46 essay period because there was 46 weeks in succession where I sent out these email blasts to people, and then more and more people said, hey, I want to get those too, kind of thing. And finally I was sending it out to like 40 or 50 people.
In the process of reading all these letters then, did you have a sense that you could really get inside these men and what they were thinking and how they approached life and their ambitions and their struggles?
You really got to know them, and that's why I felt it was so important to provide these brief bios at the end. And it's Appendix A, and it's a big chunk of the book. I've had some readers come back to me and say, you know, I read those separately. I read all of them, you know, as opposed to something you could use as a reference. Oh, William Smith, what happened to him? Kind of thing. Well, yes, you can find that out, and easy to look that person up. But
so what did happen to some of these men?
So let's pick a few of them. So you started with Thomas Seacord. Thomas Seacord ended up never seeing his wife again. He got sick in Mississippi. He ended up in a hospital, and he was what sometimes happened to people that were in hospitals. They didn't necessarily have in the field nurses and so on. So they expected people that were not so sick to sort of help out the other hospital staff with some of the patients. And he would go around and he would, you know, tell, you know, so-and-so died overnight or so on. And then a couple weeks later, he was one of those people, and he was buried there. William Smith, who I had just mentioned, who wrote so beautifully, ended up dying also in Mississippi at, I don't want to call it the Battle of Coffeyville, it's more like a sort of a large skirmish. I actually wrote a little bit about that in, for those of you who are Illinois State Historical Society members, in Illinois Heritage, in their July-August issue about...
How about Captain Norton? He was wooing this young lady he had never met.
So Captain Norton was an aide to General Palmer. And when they were in Georgia, they were taking in part of the sort of overview of where the, you know, the troops on the Union and the Confederate side were there. And Wiley Sword, in one of his books, I think it's called maybe Profiles in Courage, where he picks out various soldiers. Turns out Norton, I found out later, was one that he had picked out. And so there was a couple of Confederate sharpshooters who had snuck into range, and they were aiming to shoot Palmer. And so they fired, and they missed. But they hit Norton. I think he got hit in the head, and he died within a minute or two. So he never, ever met Molly Chapman back in Illinois.
I've got to believe that you get so involved with these people's stories that kind of stabs you in the heart when you get a piece of news like that.
There are so many stories. There are the ones that, you know, they were POWs. And I have a different chapter on POWs because, so here's the beauty of Civil War letters. They were not censored. So that's why you get all this great information. The one exception to that is prisoner of war letters. You know, you couldn't say who you were with or so on. You could say, oh, I'm feeling okay, or, you know, I have a touch of pneumonia, or whatever it might be, but they couldn't give away much in the way of details. So they're very kind of bland. But for that chapter, as an exception, I took some of the soldiers' reminiscences and what they said about being at Belle Island prisoner of war camp in Richmond, or Andersonville in Georgia, and some of the other ones, to sort of flesh out the Illinois soldier experience.
I think one of the most tragic events of the Civil War happened after the Civil War, when all those prisoners released from Andersonville get on the steamship Sultana,
yes,
which sinks in the middle of the Mississippi River, taking scores, if not hundreds of them, to their death.
Yeah, hundreds of them. Yeah, the boilers blew because it was way overloaded, and yeah, a lot of people drowned.
Well, there's so much to talk about in this book. It was such an excellent read. I hope that those who are watching this today or in the future will take the opportunity to buy this. But I got just a couple more questions here.
Sure.
How well has the book been received?
I think it has been well received. So earlier this year, the Illinois State Historical Society honored the book by giving it the Russell P. Strange Memorial Book of the Year Award for 2020. And because of the pandemic, I got that news through snail mail. A certificate came in, and you could have pushed me over with a feather. I was so shocked. But they had recognized it as that's their highest award for publishing in history. The book now is starting to take on a life of its own. There was someone who contacted me. They said they would like to develop a curriculum from that. Somebody else, this is actually down at SIU Carbondale. It sounds like that they are interested in doing podcasts of parts of the book and then uploading those. They call themselves Blanket Fort Radio Theater. So that's one of those things you could put in a search engine and it'll pop up what they're currently working on. So maybe they'll be able to do this fall in 2021.
So similar to what we had in terms of finding people who are willing to bring these quotes to life.
Exactly.
That sounds ideal for a podcast.
Yeah, I hope they go through with it. It would be excellent.
How many other books are there out there like this in other states or collections of letters that have been edited in the manner that you've done it?
Well, there's quite a number of collections that are one soldier. Or in some cases, what I call the double rainbow is when you have the soldiers' letters and the spouses or, those people at home. So you can kind of see the exchange. But in terms of collections of letters, there are some that are like just small collections, like maybe 20 soldiers because they were in the same regiment or from the same area or from a variety of areas. But the one that I found that comes the closest and was done before my book was by John Zim, called This Wicked Rebellion, and it is about letters from Wisconsin. But it's all letters sent to editors. And so people had kept these scrapbooks of all these local Wisconsin newspapers. And so they had all these soldiers' letters. But they're not all personal letters. Sometimes there's, dear editor, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes they are letters that went home and then somebody at home said, oh, let's put this in the local newspaper. So some of them are a little more guarded or maybe have an axe to grind or to bring up a point or something like that. What I used was just simply personal letters. If it was official correspondence or some other thing that was not personal, like diaries, for example, diaries are not necessarily conversational, and soldiers kept those for various reasons. I didn't include those. I just wanted those personal letters, those personal stories with those details.
Well, I think so much of what you've got in the book, these are universal themes that any soldier from any northern state could relate to, and the public would be well served to read this if they want to understand Pennsylvania or Ohio or New York even. And I think now it's time to turn it over to Joe. He might have a couple comments or questions.
Yes, a wonderful presentation, gentlemen. And to Mark Flotow, thank you so much as someone who was born and raised at the very southern tip of the state. Thank you for correctly pronouncing my hometown, Cairo, Illinois, correctly. So many people get it Cairo or Cairo or whatever. But we've had folks checking in from Arizona, Florida, Kansas, Virginia, Texas, Oregon, Nevada, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, even a viewer in Yemen, around the world watching today. And we have several questions that tie into the broader themes of this. William wants to know, Mark, were there any families and letters who had sons on both sides of the conflict?
None that I read for this particular book, although there's certainly those sorts of circumstances. Now, I did have one or two instances where there was a father and son that went to fight in the same regiment, as if the father was going to keep an eye on the son. kind of thing, so that they would experience together. I was surprised, actually, even though, as I'd said earlier, the median age was around 23 and a half, how many soldiers I found that were in their 40s or 50s or had been Mexican war veterans that still went on and went into the Civil War. And I don't mean necessarily higher officers. Some of these were privates that were in their 50s. So no, I didn't come across those, but some father-son that went together as family members, and brothers too.
Lisa wants to know, do any of the letters speak about having seen Lincoln himself or who had known him?
I cannot think anybody who said that they saw Lincoln, but there is a very interesting letter where soldiers in Springfield that were waiting for their final pay and discharge went to the Lincoln home and talked to the woman or the lady of the house, which was actually Mrs. Lucian Tilton. The Tiltons had a rental agreement with the Lincoln family to live there while the Lincolns were in Washington, D.C. And so you find out a little bit about the Lincoln home. One thing that was shared with the Lincoln home folks here was that they mentioned that the lady of the house played the piano for them. And they said, this is the first thing we've heard that there might have been a piano there. Now, who put it there, whether it was the Tiltons or the Lincolns, that's for somebody else to figure out. But it's one of those little gems that you get from a letter.
If I can add just a quick note on that, the vast majority of Illinois soldiers fought in the Western Theater. Lincoln saw an awful lot of soldiers, but it was almost entirely in the Eastern Theater of Operations, I would think.
Very good point. Yes, that's correct.
Couple of questions here that tie in together. First, from Brad in Silver Spring, Maryland, wants to know, you touched on a little bit with one of the soldiers' letters, but what did the soldiers write about Lincoln and how his actions affected morale?
All right, so there is a chapter called Leaders, Generals, and Old Abe. So soldiers wrote a lot about those that were over them, that were in charge, and whether, some of them were very happy with the decisions they were made, and some of them were very critical. And so there were certainly comments about Old Abe. As the one that you had picked up, and we had read here, that Abe is the man for us. There were others that were critical when things looked bad, when the war was going badly, that our leaders are, they're not together. And again, what's in the back of their mind is, when are we going to get home? When is this war going to be over?
I think it is relevant to suggest, though, that the soldiers, given a chance to vote in that 1864 election, most would say overwhelmingly they came down on the side of Lincoln and not McClellan, who was the Democratic
That is absolutely true. And as a footnote to that, because of the way the Constitution in Illinois was, soldiers in the field were not one of the states, Illinois was not one of the states that could vote in the field. There were some that were able to get home and vote, but that was the only way they could do that.
Now, we mentioned a while ago that one of our viewers this afternoon is chimed in from Yemen.
Yes.
Angela says, greetings from Germany.
Hi.
And follows up to Brad's question, says, brilliant question. She would like to expand that to whether there are any letters where the writer and the recipient were on different sides of the conflict.
Not in the letters that I read. I do have a few letters where they wrote to an uncle that was like in another regiment, or fellow soldiers that were perhaps in another theater of war. But no, I didn't, for this sample of 165 that I used, I didn't have an instance like that. That's an interesting thing.
Mark asked, did you see any letters from deserters on either side and their reasons for desertion?
There are definitely letters where they talk about people that did desert, or sometimes it was an instance that they called French leave. And French leave means it's something where, in France, it's where somebody leaves a party without telling the host or hostess that they're leaving, kind of thing. It's sort of a slightly impolite thing. So slowly, for the soldiers, French leave was something where I'm going to leave for a little bit and then I'm going to come back. Well, in the military's eyes, that's desertion. But some went back because, oh, my spouse is about to deliver, or my father is dying, and they couldn't get a furlough. So they might desert for that particular reason. Sometimes they weren't caught, sometimes they got pardoned. Often soldiers saw themselves, hey, I volunteered. So all this military stuff, is flexible. Well, that, of course, is not true, but they tried to flex it in certain circumstances.
And lastly, nice to hear from Jenny Lee on her lunch hour, watching from just down the hall here, literally in the same building. She's part of our conservation preservation team. They take all of those old documents and other items and restore them. Just incredible work that they do. She wants to know, did you use letters from other institutions to draw from your book?
No, I actually did not. I looked at other institutions. I looked at the Logan Museum. I looked at the library down at Carbondale, the University, Southern Illinois University at Carbondale, and a few other places. And for various reasons, I ended up not using them. The letters that I found here covered not only the span of topics, but also the geography and backgrounds and political ideology that sort of spanned the gamut. The other thing is, as a former demographer, I realize I'm in the last quarter or last fifth of my life. So I got to get a move on if I'm going to get the book out, kind of thing. There's much more out there, but no, I was able to do this. And because I'm an independent scholar and I don't have other funding sources to be able to travel, although there are more and more things that are interesting that are online, I did enjoy looking at the real thing here.
Well, that's certainly a testament to folks that are doing research of any kind. Chances are good, if it has to do with Illinois, the Civil War, Lincoln, you can likely find it at our library.
Joe, there are more than 1,000 Civil War era collections right here in this institution.
And one last thing, as we have about a minute before we wrap up, let everybody get back to work or whatever else they're doing this afternoon. Mark Flotow, how can folks get a copy of In Their Letters, In Their Words, Illinois Civil War Soldiers Ride Home?
So at the bottom of this slide here is the book website, which is the markflotow.net. Markflotow.net sounds like it's going to be all about me. No, guess what? It was an available domain name. It's strictly about the book. If you go there, on the home page, on the right side, there are links to SIU Press, there are links to various reviews of the book. There is all sorts of different pages, question of the week, kind of thing, which is, again, it's a Friday thing. Every Friday I update with new information. There is the addendum thing. So if you wanted to read that full description of that letter about Missionary Ridge, it is on that page, and it goes on for quite a while. Here locally in Springfield, I recommend Books on the Square because they have copies that I've already put my name to. Barnes & Noble has been known to have it, but of course there's the usual sources. You can go to Google or Amazon. I do recommend SIU Press. They got sort of a 2-for-1 deal where you can get the electronic version, the ebook version, and the regular book as for a reduced price. It's like 2-for-1. They gave me a copy of the electronic version, and I said, yeah, thanks, I don't know what I'll do with it. I do a lot with it. The book has an incredible index. I hired one of the best people possible, one of the readers, Glenna Schroeder-Line, to do that. But it is so great to use the electronic version to word search. So you've read something and you go, hey, where was that thing about slavery to the naked eye? And you can just put in those words and it'll pop up in the ebook. So I found it's worth having both.
Needless to say, a great Christmas gift.
Yes, Christmas is coming right up. Thank you, Joe.
That's just trying to help, just trying to help. Mark DePue, as always, thank you for a wonderful job of moderating the discussion.
Thank you.
And Mark Flotow, the author of and editor of, well, actually the Civil War soldiers wrote the letters, but you edited it all together, put it into context. In their letters, in their words, Illinois Civil War soldiers write home. Thank you for the presentation today, a wonderful discussion.
My pleasure. Hi, everybody out there in Facebook land.
Well, thanks all for watching, and hope you can join us soon live from the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum in Springfield, Illinois. Have a wonderful afternoon.